Mason Hale stopped because no one else would. The shoulder stretched empty beneath a phoenix moon, and the woman standing beside the smoking hood looked like she carried secrets heavier than her stranded car. He gave her a ride. He asked no questions. Hours later, the Marines came, boots on his doorstep, rifles glinting under porch light, engines idling like metal beasts waiting to devour his tiny home. His daughter woke to the sound of men who do not knock gently. Mason learned that kindness in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. Now he must decide if protecting Piper means running from the truth or walking straight into the fire that will consume them both. Subscribe to see what Mason chooses when the past refuses to stay buried. The highway breathed under a moon that hung low and full, casting silver across the cracked asphalt that stretched toward Phoenix like a vein of pale light cutting through desert dark. Mason Hale gripped the steering wheel of his aging sedan, knuckles tight against worn leather, eyes scanning the road ahead with the practiced weariness of a man who had learned to see danger in stillness. The rideshare app on his phone had gone quiet an hour ago. The last fare dropped at a hotel near Scottsdale, and now the drive home was just him and the hum of tires against pavement. The radio turned low to a station that played songs he half remembered from before his life became small. He passed the mile marker that meant 20 minutes until home. 20 minutes until he could slip into Piper's room and watch her sleep, her small chest rising and falling with the innocence he fought every day to preserve. The desert night pressed against the windows, vast and indifferent, and Mason let himself breathe in the temporary peace of empty roads and open sky. Then he saw the car. It sat crooked on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking red like a heartbeat stuttering against the night, hood lifted and steam rising in ghostly ribbons that dissolved into the air. A figure stood beside it, arms wrapped around herself, silhouette sharp against the moonlight, and Mason felt the reflex kick in before his mind caught up, the reflex to stop, to help. The same instinct that had once made him a good soldier and later a man too broken to be anything but cautious. He slowed, pulling onto the shoulder behind the stranded vehicle, gravel crunching under his tires, and for a moment he sat there, engine idling, watching the woman turn toward his headlights with a look that was neither relief nor fear, but something suspended between the two. She was younger than him, maybe early 30s, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted jacket that looked too deliberate for a casual drive. Her hair pulled back in a way that suggested control, precision, and when their eyes met through the windshield, Mason felt a flicker of recognition he could not name. Not of her face, but of the weight she carried in her posture. The kind of burden that only comes from knowing too much. He stepped out of the car, the desert air cooler than expected, carrying the scent of sage and gasoline, and walked toward her with his hands visible, open, the universal language of someone who means no harm. She watched him approach, her gaze steady, assessing, and when he spoke his voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by too many nights of not enough sleep and too many conversations with strangers who never stayed long enough to matter. He asked if she needed help, if she had called for a tow, and she nodded slowly, lips parting as if to speak but hesitating. And in that pause, Mason noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly against her arms, the way her breath came shallow and controlled, and he understood, without being told, that whatever had stranded her here was more than mechanical failure. She introduced herself as Leora, no last name, and her voice carried an authority that seemed at odds with the vulnerability of her situation. Each word measured and deliberate, and Mason found himself offering a ride before she could ask, before he could second-guess the impulse that had always gotten him into trouble. They drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, the city lights of Phoenix beginning to glow on the horizon, like embers scattered across the dark. And Mason kept his eyes on the road, while Leora sat beside him, her presence filling the small space of his sedan with a tension he could not quite identify. She smelled faintly of leather and something sharper, metallic, and when he glanced sideways, he saw her hands resting in her lap, fingers laced together, knuckles white with pressure she was trying to contain. He did not ask questions because he had learned that people stranded on highways at night usually had reasons they preferred not to share, and besides, his own life was built on the foundation of unanswered questions, of truths he had buried so deep he sometimes forgot they existed at all. Leora broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the hum of the engine with a softness that felt almost apologetic, and she thanked him, said most people would not have stopped, and Mason shrugged because he did not know how to explain that stopping was easier than driving past, that ignoring someone in need felt too much like the things he had done in war, the choices that still woke him at 3 a.m, with his heart pounding and his daughter's name on his lips. She asked where he was headed, and he told her the truth. Home, to a neighborhood on the edge of Phoenix, where the houses were small and the yards were dust, where single fathers scraped by on rideshare wages and tried not to think too hard about the future. Leora nodded, her gaze drifting to the window, and Mason saw the reflection of her face in the glass, features softened by distance, but eyes still sharp, still carrying that weight he recognized. He wanted to ask what she was running from. What kind of trouble left a woman like her stranded on a desert highway with no visible luggage and a look that said she had been expecting something worse than engine failure? But the words stayed lodged in his throat, because asking meant opening a door he was not sure he wanted to walk through. Instead, he drove, following the familiar route that would take them both to wherever she needed to go, and tried to ignore the way his instincts, the soldier's instincts he had tried so hard to bury, were screaming that this was not just a stranded motorist, that this was something else entirely. When they reached the outskirts of the city, Leora directed him to a motel near the airport. The kind of place with flickering neon signs and rooms that rented by the hour, and Mason pulled into the parking lot without comment, the engine ticking as it cooled in the night air. She thanked him again, her hand reaching for the door handle, and for a moment their eyes met in the dim light of the dashboard, and Mason saw something there. Gratitude, yes, but also a warning, a silent acknowledgement that their paths had crossed for reasons neither of them fully understood. She stepped out into the night, the door closing with a soft click, and Mason watched her walk toward the motel entrance, her figure swallowed by shadows, and he felt the unease settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He drove home through streets that felt emptier than usual, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, and by the time he pulled into his driveway and killed the engine, the moon had risen higher, casting long shadows across his tiny yard. He sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, trying to shake the feeling that stopping for Leora Grant had been the beginning of something he could not yet see, something that would not let him walk away unscathed. Mason woke to the sound of boots, not the shuffle of sneakers on pavement or the soft tap of dress shoes, but the deliberate, measured thud of combat boots hitting concrete, each step a statement of purpose, of arrival, of something inevitable descending upon his small corner of the world. He lay in the dark of his bedroom, heart already accelerating before his mind caught up to what he was hearing, and for a moment he was back in Afghanistan, listening to the approach of patrols in the night, the way sound carried differently in war zones, sharper, more immediate, every noise a potential threat. Then Piper's voice cut through the fog of memory, high and thin with confusion, calling for him from her room down the hall, and Mason was on his feet, moving through the dark with the muscle memory of a man who had learned to navigate chaos without hesitation. He reached her doorway as the first knock came. Not a knock, really, but a pounding that shook the front door in its frame, authoritative and unyielding, the kind of summons that did not expect to be ignored. Piper sat up in bed, her silhouette small against the glow of her nightlight, and Mason crossed to her in 3 strides, kneeling beside her mattress and placing a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through her thin frame. He told her to stay put, to be quiet, his voice low and steady even as his pulse hammered in his ears, and she nodded, wide eyes reflecting the faint light from the hallway, trusting him in the way only children can trust their parents, with a faith that made his chest tighten with fear and determination in equal measure. The pounding came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice that cut through the walls like a blade. Military, clipped, demanding entry in tones that brooked no argument, and Mason forced himself to breathe, to think, to not let the panic rising in his throat choke him before he understood what was happening. He moved to the front of the house, bare feet silent on the worn carpet, and paused at the window beside the door, carefully pulling back the edge of the curtain to peer outside into the pre-dawn darkness. What he saw stopped his breath. 3 Humvees sat in the street, engines idling, headlights cutting harsh white beams across his yard, and between them stood men in desert combat uniforms, rifles held at ready positions, faces shadowed beneath helmets and night vision gear. Marines, he recognized the insignia, the stance, the way they moved with coordinated precision, forming a perimeter around his house as if expecting resistance, as if his tiny home on this quiet street had suddenly become enemy territory. Mason counted 6 of them, maybe more in the shadows beyond the light, and his mind raced through possibilities. None of them good, all of them circling back to the woman on the highway, to Leora Grant and her measured words and the weight she carried like armor. The pounding came a 3rd time, and with it the command to open the door immediately, to comply with federal authority, and Mason felt the old training kick in, the instinct to assess, to plan, to find an exit even when surrounded. But there was no exit here, not with Piper in the next room and armed men outside every window. He opened the door slowly, hands raised and visible, palms out, the gesture of surrender he had seen on countless faces during deployments, and the lead Marine stepped forward, a captain by his insignia, face hard and eyes scanning Mason's features with the intensity of someone looking for deception. The captain asked for identification, for confirmation of his name and address, and Mason complied, voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut, answering questions with the brevity he remembered from military interrogations, offering nothing more than what was asked. Behind the captain, the other Marines maintained their positions, weapons ready but not raised, a show of force designed to intimidate without overtly threatening, and Mason understood the message being sent. Cooperation was not optional. Resistance would be met with overwhelming response. The captain asked about the previous night, about his movements, about any passengers he might have transported, and Mason felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The connection forming between the stranded woman and the armed men now occupying his front yard, like an invading force. He told them about Leora, keeping his answers factual and emotionless, describing the broken-down car, the ride to the motel, the brief exchange of words that had seemed so ordinary at the time. The captain listened without expression, then asked if Mason had noticed anything unusual about the woman, about her behavior or possessions, and Mason shook his head, repeating that it had been a simple act of assistance, nothing more. Nothing that warranted this kind of response. But even as he spoke, he saw the doubt in the captain's eyes, the calculation happening behind that professional mask, and Mason realized with cold certainty that his explanation was not enough, that his involvement with Leora Grant had marked him as something more than an innocent bystander. The captain stepped closer, lowering his voice to a register meant for Mason's ears alone, and said that the woman he had helped was connected to a matter of national security, that Mason's vehicle had been identified at multiple locations associated with a military intelligence breach, and that he needed to understand the seriousness of his situation. The words hit Mason like physical blows, each syllable stripping away the thin veneer of normalcy he had built around his life, exposing the raw nerve of his past and the vulnerability of his present. He thought of Piper, listening in the darkness of her room, of the way her small hand had gripped his earlier, trusting him to keep her safe, and he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like earth piled on a grave. The captain was still talking, outlining the investigation, the need for Mason's cooperation, the potential consequences if he withheld information or attempted to interfere, but Mason's attention had fractured, part of him still standing on this porch facing armed authority, while another part retreated into the soldier's mindset he had sworn to leave behind, the cold. Tactical assessment of threat levels and escape routes, and the cost of every decision measured in lives rather than consequences. He agreed to cooperate, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, and watched as the Marines began to withdraw, their mission apparently satisfied for now, Boots retreating toward the Humvees with the same measured precision they had arrived with, leaving Mason alone on his porch as the first light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky with streaks of amber and gold. Piper stood at her window long after Mason returned to her room, small hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging the pain in shallow bursts as she watched the last Humvee roll away down their street, its taillights fading into the grey pre-dawn light like red eyes closing in the distance. Mason knelt beside her, one hand on her narrow back, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat transmitted through the thin fabric of her nightgown, and he tried to find words that would make sense of armed men surrounding their home, words that would not terrify her more than she already was. But language felt inadequate against the enormity of what had just happened, against the way their quiet life had been violated by forces neither of them understood, and so he simply held her, drawing her away from the window and back toward her bed, murmuring reassurances that felt hollow even as he spoke them. Piper's questions came in a torrent. Why were those men here? Why did they have weapons? Were they in trouble? Was someone trying to hurt them? And Mason answered with careful half-truths, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that the men were just doing their jobs, that everything would be fine, all the while feeling the lie settle between them like a wall he was building to keep her innocence intact. She did not believe him. Mason could see it in the way her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the truth he was not giving her, the way her lower lip trembled slightly before she caught it between her teeth. A gesture she had inherited from him, the physical manifestation of swallowing fear and pretending to be brave. He sat with her until the trembling stopped, until her breathing evened out and the tension drained from her small shoulders, and then he tucked her back under the covers, smoothing her hair away from her forehead with gentle fingers, remembering when she was an infant, and this gesture alone could soothe any distress. Now, at 8 years old, she was too perceptive to be easily comforted, too aware of the currents running beneath the surface of adult conversations, and Mason felt the weight of that awareness like a failure, as if by bringing danger to their doorstep he had stolen something precious from her that could never be returned. He promised to stay nearby, to keep her safe, and she nodded against her pillow, eyes already drifting closed with the exhaustion that comes after adrenaline fades. Her trust in him absolute, despite everything, despite the armed men and the fear and the questions he could not fully answer. Mason moved through the house as dawn broke properly, light filtering through curtains in shades of rose and amber, illuminating the modest space he had made into a home through sheer, stubborn determination. The living room, with its second-hand furniture and Piper's drawings taped to the walls, the kitchen with its mismatched dishes and the coffee maker that rattled when it brewed, the hallway with its gallery of photographs documenting Piper's 8 years of life, birthdays and school plays and ordinary moments elevated to significance by the simple act of being remembered. He stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the evidence of the small, careful life he had built, and felt it beginning to crack under the pressure of forces he had invited in with a single act of kindness. The captain's words echoed in his mind. National security breach, intelligence leak, Mason's vehicle identified at multiple locations, and he tried to piece together how giving a ride to a stranded woman could have entangled him in something that brought Marines to his door in the dead of night. The answer, when it came, arrived with the rising sun and a text message on his phone, the screen glowing in his hand as he sat at the kitchen table nursing black coffee that had gone cold while he stared at nothing. The message was from an unknown number, just 3 words that made his blood run cold in his veins. "They're watching you." No signature, no explanation, but Mason knew with certainty that it came from Leora, that somehow she had gotten his number, probably from his ride-share profile, easy enough if you knew where to look, and was warning him about surveillance he should have anticipated, but had been too shaken to consider. He looked up from the phone, scanning the windows, the street visible through gaps in the curtains, and saw nothing obvious, no suspicious vehicles or figures lingering in sight. But that meant nothing. If they wanted to watch him, they would do it properly, with equipment and training that made detection nearly impossible. And Mason felt the paranoia beginning to creep in, the old wartime habit of seeing threats in every shadow, of trusting nothing and no one because survival depended on constant vigilance. Piper emerged from her room as the morning stretched toward 8, dressed for school in jeans and a sweater printed with stars, backpack slung over one shoulder, and Mason felt his heart constrict at the normalcy of the scene, at how desperately he wanted to preserve this routine, this ordinary progression of breakfast and bus stops and homework that defined their lives. She asked if she could still go to school, uncertainty flickering across her face as if she expected him to say no, to lock the doors and keep her hidden from whatever threat had manifested in the night. But Mason nodded and set about making her breakfast, scrambling eggs and toasting bread while keeping his movements smooth and unhurried, projecting a calm he did not feel. They ate together at the small table, Piper chattering about a project due next week and a friend's upcoming birthday party, her words filling the space with the resilient cheer of childhood reasserting itself. And Mason responded when appropriate, laughing at the right moments, asking questions that showed he was listening, all the while calculating the risks of sending her to school versus keeping her home, weighing her safety against the danger of disrupting her life too visibly. He walked her to the bus stop 3 blocks away, hand in hand along the sidewalk lined with mesquite trees and desert landscaping, and they stood together among the other parents and children waiting for the yellow bus to round the corner. Mason scanned faces, looking for anyone who seemed too interested, too observant, but saw only the familiar neighbors, the tired working parents and sleepy kids going through morning rituals identical to his own. When the bus arrived and Piper climbed aboard, turning to wave at him from her seat by the window, Mason waved back with a smile that felt like it might crack his face, holding the expression until the bus pulled away and disappeared around the bend. Only then did he let the mask slip, shoulders sagging under the weight of fear and uncertainty, and he walked back to the house through streets that suddenly felt hostile, every parked car a potential surveillance point, every passing stranger a possible threat. He thought of Leora's warning, of the Marines who had surrounded his home, of Piper's trembling silhouette at the window, and understood with terrible clarity that helping a woman on the highway had opened a door he did not know how to close, had pulled him into a current that was already dragging him toward depths he could not see, but could feel pulling at his ankles like undertow in dark water. The second contact came at noon, when Mason's phone buzzed with an incoming call from the same unknown number that had sent the warning text hours earlier. He answered without preamble, voice flat and guarded, and heard Leora's voice on the other end, crisp and urgent, stripped of the measured calm she had maintained during their brief encounter the night before. She told him they needed to meet, that she could explain what was happening, but not over the phone, not where their conversation could be monitored and recorded, and Mason felt the instinct to refuse rise up sharp and immediate. He had Piper to think about, had a life that was already too fragile to withstand more upheaval, had no obligation to this woman who had brought armed men to his doorstep. But Leora pressed on before he could voice his objection, her words tumbling out with an intensity that suggested genuine fear, genuine desperation, and she said that if he did not hear her out, if he did not understand what was truly happening, then he and his daughter would remain in danger, regardless of how much distance he tried to put between them. That stopped him. The mention of Piper, the implicit acknowledgement that his daughter was already entangled in whatever web Leora had woven, cut through his resistance like a blade through cloth. And Mason found himself agreeing to meet, even as part of his mind screamed warnings about traps and manipulation and the thousand ways this could go wrong. They arranged to meet at a park on the far side of the city, public enough to feel safe but sprawling enough to allow for private conversation. And Mason ended the call with a sense of dread settling in his stomach like lead. He had 3 hours before Piper's school let out, 3 hours to learn what he had stumbled into and figure out how to extract himself and his daughter from the consequences of one moment of decency on a moonlit highway. He left the house with the same paranoid caution that had defined his movements since dawn, checking mirrors and varying his route, watching for vehicles that followed too closely or appeared too frequently, the old skills returning as if the intervening years had never happened. The park was exactly as he remembered, from a birthday party Piper had attended months ago. Wide green lawns, bordered by palm trees and desert vegetation, playgrounds and picnic areas scattered across acreage that felt almost surreal in its lushness against the arid landscape beyond. Mason arrived early and walked the perimeter, noting exits and sightlines, identifying places where someone could observe from concealment, and by the time Leora appeared, walking across the grass with her hands in her jacket pockets and sunglasses hiding her eyes, he had mapped the terrain in his mind with the thoroughness of a soldier preparing for engagement. She sat beside him on a bench near the children's play area, close enough that their conversation would be covered by the sounds of kids laughing and shouting, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of unasked questions hanging between them like smoke in still air. Leora began without apology, her voice low and controlled, and the story she told was one of betrayal and conspiracy, nested inside military intelligence operations that Mason barely understood but recognized as the kind of classified work that destroyed lives when it went wrong. She explained that she worked for a military intelligence unit tasked with tracking weapons proliferation in the Middle East, that her team had uncovered evidence of illegal arms transfers involving American weapons systems, and that someone within the Pentagon had leaked information to cover up the operation. The leak had been traced back to her unit, fingers pointed at her team as the source, and now they were being systematically destroyed, careers ended, security clearances revoked, some members facing criminal charges for treason they did not commit. Leora had been fleeing when her car broke down, running from the machinery of military justice that was grinding toward her with inexorable force, and Mason's intervention had created a paper trail that connected them both, that made him an accessory, a person of interest, someone who could be used to pressure her or frame her further. Mason listened in silence, mind racing through implications, and when she finished, he asked the question that mattered most: why his truck had been identified at multiple locations connected to the intelligence breach. Leora's jaw tightened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her composure, and she admitted that someone had used Mason's vehicle as part of the frame, that surveillance footage showing his sedan at dead drops and meeting locations had been fabricated or staged using his license plate, that his act of kindness had been weaponized against both of them in ways she was still trying to unravel. The sophistication of the operation suggested resources beyond what any single rogue operative could muster, pointed toward coordinated effort by people with access to intelligence apparatus and the willingness to burn innocent lives to protect their own interests. Mason felt the rage building in his chest, cold and focused, the kind of anger that had once made him effective in combat and later nearly destroyed him when he could not shut it off after coming home. He asked what she wanted from him, what possible role he could play in unraveling a conspiracy that involved military intelligence and Pentagon cover-ups and forces so far beyond his ability to influence that the question felt absurd, even as he spoke it. Leora turned to look at him directly, removing her sunglasses so he could see her eyes, and in them Mason recognized the same desperate calculation he had seen in mirror reflections during his worst nights after discharge. The look of someone who had run out of good options and was now choosing between varieties of bad. She told him that she needed his help to prove her innocence, that the evidence trail leading back to his vehicle was both the weapon being used against her and potentially the key to exposing who had manufactured it. If they could trace how his truck had been used, identify when and where the surveillance footage had been captured, they might be able to demonstrate that the entire case against her unit was built on fabrication and framework. It was a thin thread to hang hope on, Mason knew, but Leora spoke with the conviction of someone who had already accepted that thin threads were all that remained. Mason thought of Piper, of her small hand in his as they walked to the bus stop that morning, of the trust in her eyes when she looked at him and saw safety, protection, everything a father was supposed to provide. He thought of the Marines surrounding his house, of the warning text, of the surveillance that was almost certainly watching him even now, and he understood that walking away was not really an option, that whether he helped Leora or refused her, he was already marked, already entangled in consequences that would follow him regardless of choice. The only question was whether he faced those consequences passively, waiting for the hammer to fall, or whether he took action, however inadequate, to try and shape the outcome towards something that preserved what mattered most. He met Leora's gaze and nodded slowly, committing himself to a course of action that felt simultaneously inevitable and insane, and saw relief wash across her features like rain breaking a drought. They spoke for another 20 minutes, making plans, exchanging information, agreeing to meet again after Mason ensured Piper was secure, and then Leora stood and walked away across the grass, her figure growing smaller against the backdrop of palm trees and blue sky until she disappeared beyond the park boundaries. Mason sat alone on the bench long after she left, watching children play and parents watch and the ordinary world continue spinning as if nothing had changed, as if his entire existence had not just tilted on an axis he could not see but could feel in every nerve and bone. The nightmares returned that night with a viciousness Mason had not experienced in years, pulling him down into memories he thought he had successfully buried beneath layers of civilian routine and deliberate forgetting. He found himself back in Helmand Province, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood, standing in the ruins of a compound where his unit had engaged insurgents hours earlier. The details were hyper-real in the way trauma makes certain moments. The texture of the wall he pressed against for cover, the sound of his own breathing harsh and ragged in his ears, the weight of his rifle in hands that shook with exhaustion and adrenaline aftermath. But the nightmare twisted the memory, adding elements that did not belong, blending past and present until he saw Piper standing in the compound rubble, her small figure incongruous among the destruction, and he was running toward her through air that felt like moving through water, trying to reach her before the threat he could sense but not see descended upon them both. He woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the darkness of his bedroom disorienting, until memory reasserted itself and he remembered where he was. Phoenix, not Afghanistan. Safe in a house that was his own, thousands of miles from war zones and combat operations. But his heart continued to hammer against his ribs, body still flooded with the chemical legacy of perceived danger, and Mason forced himself to breathe slowly, counting breaths the way the therapist at the VA had taught him years ago, trying to anchor himself in present reality rather than the ghost country his mind insisted on returning to. The technique worked eventually. Pulse slowing, awareness expanding beyond the tunnel vision of panic, and he became conscious of sounds beyond his own breathing. The house settling, traffic distant on the freeway, the reassuring quiet that meant nothing was immediately wrong. He checked his phone reflexively, seeing the time displayed in pale blue numerals. 3:47 in the morning, the hour when the world feels most fragile, most temporary. Mason knew he would not sleep again, knew from experience that once the nightmares came they tended to cluster, one bleeding into the next if he closed his eyes too soon. So he rose and moved through the dark house to the living room, settling on the couch with a blanket, and the television turned to a news channel with the sound muted. The images flickered across the screen without penetrating his thoughts, which had turned inward, spiraling around the question of why now, why the past was reasserting itself with such force after years of relative stability. The answer was obvious, of course. The Marines at his door, Leora's revelations about military intelligence operations and conspiracy, the way his brief contact with her had dragged up all the associations between authority and violence, and the machinery of institutions that ground individuals into dust without malice or mercy. He had thought himself inoculated against these triggers, thought the distance of years and the deliberate construction of a civilian identity had insulated him from the worst of his war trauma. But apparently he had only been in remission, the infection dormant rather than cured. He remembered Afghanistan in fragments now, moments rather than narrative, and some of those moments felt more like they belonged to someone else, to a younger version of Mason Hale, who had believed in clear missions and righteous causes, and the possibility of making things better through force of will and superior firepower. He remembered the heat, always the heat, the way it seemed to bake thought out of your skull and leave only instinct and training. The way gear chafed and water tasted like plastic and dust, worked into every crevice until you felt more earth than human. He remembered the faces of the men in his unit, some still alive somewhere, others reduced to names on memorials and photographs in locked drawers, and the particular quality of camaraderie that formed under shared threat, deeper than friendship, more primal, the bond of people who depended on each other for survival and knew that dependency could be tested without warning at any moment. And he remembered the guilt, always the guilt, the corrosive awareness that he had made decisions in combat that took lives, that followed orders that resulted in destruction, that participated in a war whose righteousness became increasingly questionable the longer he spent fighting it. The discharge had been both relief and abandonment, cutting him loose from the structure that had defined his adult life, and setting him adrift in a civilian world that had no use for the skills he had developed and no interest in the experiences that haunted him. He had stumbled through those first years, working jobs that felt meaningless, drinking too much, isolating himself from connections that required vulnerability or explanation, until Piper's mother appeared in his life like grace he did not deserve, brilliant and fierce and somehow willing to see past the damage he wore like armor. Their relationship had been brief, intense, ultimately doomed by his inability to be fully present, to trust that peace could be permanent, and when she left, she took with her the illusion that he could be normal, could build something stable, could escape the gravitational pull of his past. She left him Piper, though, the pregnancy a surprise they had discovered too late for easy options. And then the birth, and then the decision, hers. Really, though she framed it as mutual, that Mason would raise their daughter because she could not, would not, tie herself to a man still at war with ghosts. And so he had become a father, the role arriving with terrifying suddenness and no manual, no training adequate to the task of keeping a tiny human alive and shaping her into someone capable of navigating the world without inheriting his damage. Piper had saved him. He understood that now, had given him a reason to surface from the depths he had been sinking toward, had demanded his presence in ways that cut through his self-isolation and made retreat impossible. He learned to function for her sake, learned to schedule days around school pickups and mealtimes, learned to be gentle when his instincts screamed for hardness, learned to smile and mean it because her joy was the only light strong enough to penetrate the darkness that lived in his chest. He had thought he was healing. He thought the years of small routines and ordinary struggles were building scar tissue strong enough to protect him from his history. But Leora's appearance and the Marines at his door had proven otherwise, had torn open wounds he had believed closed and shown him how thin the membrane was between his present life and the abyss of his past. Mason sat in the pre-dawn darkness, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent and Piper's shampoo, from when she had used it during movie night, and felt the weight of accumulated choices pressing down on his shoulders like physical mass. Every decision seemed to carry consequences that rippled outward beyond his ability to control or predict, helping Leora, refusing Leora, cooperating with the investigation, resisting it, telling Piper the truth, maintaining comforting lies, running, staying, fighting, surrendering. He understood that he stood at a crossroads not of his own making, thrust there by circumstance and his own ingrained inability to pass someone in need, and that whatever path he chose from here would determine not just his own fate, but Piper's, would shape the kind of life she lived and the kind of world she believed possible. The nightmares whispered that he was inadequate to the task, that men like him, damaged, haunted, still carrying the stench of war in their marrow, could not be trusted with protecting innocence because they understood too well how easily it could be destroyed. But dawn was coming, light beginning to grey the edges of the windows, and with it the need to rise, to make breakfast, to smile at his daughter and send her off to school, as if the world was not balanced on a knife edge, as if the echoes of his war were not threatening to drown them both. The evidence Leora brought Mason 3 days later arrived in the form of files on an encrypted thumb drive, delivered during a meeting in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Phoenix, where fluorescent lights bleached color from everything and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed in the previous decade. She slid the drive across the table wrapped in a napkin, her movements casual enough to avoid drawing attention from the scattered late-night customers nursing their own insomnia and solitude, and Mason pocketed it without comment, aware that even this exchange was a risk, that surveillance could be active despite their precautions, that every connection between them deepened the conspiracy they were trying to unravel. Leora looked worse than she had at their first meeting, exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes and mouth, hair less precisely arranged, the armor of professional competence showing cracks that revealed the fear beneath. And Mason recognized the signs of someone running on fumes, pushed past sustainable limits by necessity, and lacking any safe harbor to rest. She explained in low tones what the files contained: surveillance footage, metadata logs, communications intercepts, all pointing to a pattern of fabrication so sophisticated it had fooled military investigators initially trained to detect exactly these kinds of deceptions. Mason's sedan appeared in footage from locations he had never been, timestamps placing him at meetings with known foreign intelligence operatives, his license plate captured in parking lots outside classified facilities. the cumulative weight of evidence building a narrative of Mason as a witting or unwitting participant in espionage against his own country. But Leora and her remaining team members had found inconsistencies, tiny fractures in the constructed reality, metadata that did not match camera specifications, shadows falling at angles impossible for the stated time of day, reflections in car windows showing buildings that did not exist at the claimed locations. The fabrications were good, professional-grade forgeries that would withstand casual examination, but they were not perfect, and perfection was the standard required when lives and national security hung in the balance. Mason asked who had the capability to manufacture evidence at this level, and Leora's answer was chilling in its implications. It required access to multiple military databases, to surveillance infrastructure normally reserved for foreign intelligence gathering, to technical expertise that existed only within specific agencies whose very existence was classified beyond public knowledge. She was describing an inside operation, conspiracy nested within the institutions designed to protect against such corruption, and the scope of it suggested resources and coordination that went far beyond rogue individuals or isolated criminal enterprise. Someone with significant authority had decided that Leora's unit needed to be destroyed, that the evidence they had gathered about illegal arms transfers needed to be buried, and that any collateral damage, including Mason and his daughter, was acceptable in pursuit of that goal. The cold calculation behind such decisions made Mason's stomach turn, reminded him too much of the way war had been conducted sometimes, with civilian casualties classified as regrettable but necessary, with individual lives weighed against strategic objectives and found wanting. He studied the files over the following days, learning to navigate the encryption and interpret the technical language, piecing together the timeline of fabrication and comparing it against his actual movements during the same periods. Leora had provided him with detailed logs of his rideshare activity, obtained through methods she did not specify and Mason knew better than to ask about. And together they built a counter-narrative, demonstrating that Mason had been miles away from the locations shown in the surveillance footage, provably engaged with paying customers whose identities and destinations were logged through the rideshare app's GPS tracking. It was solid alibi evidence, the kind that should exonerate him immediately. But Mason understood with grim certainty that truth was not the point of the frame, that whoever had constructed this elaborate deception had done so knowing it might not withstand scrutiny if examined carefully enough. The goal was not perfect deception, but sufficient confusion, enough doubt and complexity to paralyze investigation and allow time for other objectives to be achieved. The real question was what those objectives were. Leora believed the frame was designed to discredit her unit's findings about arms transfers, to make their evidence inadmissible by tarnishing the investigators with suspicion of treason. But Mason sensed something more active beneath the surface, some clock ticking toward a deadline that made the elaborate deception worthwhile despite its risks. He pressed Leora for details about what her unit had uncovered. What exactly about illegal arms transfers was worth this level of institutional conspiracy to protect? And after initial resistance, she outlined a network of weapons flowing from American stockpiles into conflict zones through officially sanctioned channels that bypassed congressional oversight and end-use monitoring. The scale was enormous. Not isolated incidents, but systematic redirection of military hardware worth billions. Weapons that ended up in the hands of militias and proxy forces whose interests aligned with certain strategic objectives, but whose methods and loyalties remained dangerously fluid. Some of those weapons had been used against American forces, completing a circle of violence that turned military aid into friendly fire, through chains of transaction and betrayal. Mason listened to these revelations in the quiet of his home, after Piper had gone to bed. laptop screen casting blue light across his features as he scrolled through documents that should never have existed outside classified networks, and felt the old rage returning, not the hot fury of combat, but the cold, focused anger that came from understanding how thoroughly ordinary people were manipulated by systems that valued them only as resources to be expended. He thought about the men he had served with, who had died from weapons that might have originated in American armories, about the missions conducted to secure supply lines that apparently fed back into enemy hands through corruption so vast it seemed almost architectural. And he thought about Piper, asleep down the hall, innocent of all this darkness, and understood that the frame built in silence around him was also a cage being constructed around her future, limiting her possibilities by association with a father marked as traitor, whether the charges were true or not. The next morning brought another development, delivered via phone call from a number Mason did not recognize, but answered anyway. Some instinct telling him to hear whatever message was coming. The voice on the other end was male, professional, offering no name, but speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. And he informed Mason that he had been identified as a material witness in an ongoing military investigation, that his cooperation was mandatory rather than optional, and that failure to present himself for formal questioning within 48 hours would result in a federal warrant for obstruction of justice. The caller provided an address, a federal building downtown, office number and contact information, and disconnected before Mason could respond, leaving him standing in his kitchen with the phone still pressed to his ear and the taste of copper fear coating his tongue. The formal summons changed everything, elevated his situation from peripheral involvement to direct jeopardy, and Mason understood with cold clarity that the frame was tightening around him with mechanical precision, each piece of evidence and procedural step bringing him closer to arrest, prosecution, possibly prison. He had 48 hours to find a way through the labyrinth of conspiracy that had ensnared him. 48 hours to prove his innocence or accept that Piper would grow up with a father locked away for crimes he did not commit, for helping a stranger on a highway under a moon that now seemed to have marked the beginning of his unraveling. Mason made the decision alone, sitting at his kitchen table in the hour before dawn, when the world felt suspended between night and day, when decisions made seemed both more significant and more ephemeral, as if the liminal quality of the light permitted choices that would be impossible in full daylight's harsh clarity. He had spent the previous evening arranging Piper's care, calling in favors from neighbors and setting up stays with school friends whose parents he trusted, building a network of safety around his daughter in case the worst happened, in case the next 48 hours ended with him in federal custody and her suddenly alone. She had asked questions he deflected with practiced ease, sensing his tension, but not yet old enough to fully understand its implications, and he had tucked her in with extra care, memorizing the weight of her small body against his chest when she hugged him goodnight, storing the memory against potential future absence. Now, in the quiet house, he reviewed the plan one more time, checking for flaws, preparing mentally for outcomes that ranged from vindication to disaster. Leora had agreed to meet him at the federal building, to present their counter-evidence together rather than separately, gambling that coordination would be more effective than isolation, even if it meant putting herself directly into the hands of investigators who viewed her as the primary target. The files on the thumb drive had been copied and distributed to multiple secure locations, insurance against suppression or destruction, and Mason had memorized the names of journalists and Congressional Oversight Committee members, who Leora swore could be trusted with the information if official channels failed. It was a thin strategy built on hope that truth mattered more than institutional preservation, that somewhere in the machinery of military justice there remained individuals who would choose integrity over convenience. But Mason had learned in war that sometimes you fought with the weapons available rather than the ones you wished you had, and truth, however inadequate, was all they possessed. The morning Piper left for her stay at her friend Emma's house, Mason held her longer than usual, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, trying to project calm while memorizing this moment, in case it was the last ordinary embrace they shared before everything changed. She pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes, so much like his own, searching his face with an intensity that suggested she understood more than he had given her credit for, and she asked quietly if he was going to be okay, if the trouble was bad, if he would come get her soon. Mason forced a smile that felt like cracking stone and promised he would see her the next day, that everything would be fine, that she should just have fun with Emma and not worry about grown-up problems. And Piper nodded slowly before hugging him again, fierce and quick, then running to the car where Emma's mother waited with practiced patience and sympathetic eyes that suggested she had guessed more than Mason had explained. The drive downtown took longer than expected, traffic thick with morning commuters, and Mason used the time to steady himself, to push down the fear that wanted to paralyze him and replace it with the cold focus he remembered from pre-mission briefings when the outcome was uncertain, but the commitment was absolute. He parked in the federal building's garage and took the elevator to the 7th floor, where Leora waited near the security checkpoint. Dressed professionally in dark pants and a blazer that suggested lawyer more than fugitive, her expression composed but her hands betraying tension in the way they gripped her briefcase. They entered together, submitted to security screening, and were escorted to a conference room where 3 investigators waited, 2 men and a woman, all in civilian clothes, but carrying themselves with military bearing that marked them as clearly as uniforms would have. The interrogation that followed was simultaneously thorough and surreal, hours of questions designed to probe for inconsistencies, to test the boundaries of Mason's knowledge and Leora's explanations, to find cracks in their story that would justify the charges being prepared against them. Mason answered with careful precision, presenting the alibi evidence and the documented proof of his locations during the time surveillance footage claimed he was elsewhere, watching the investigators' faces for reactions and seeing mostly professional neutrality that gave nothing away. Leora handled the broader questions about the arms transfer investigation, laying out the pattern of evidence her unit had compiled and the systematic obstruction they had encountered when trying to report through proper channels. And Mason saw the flickers of recognition in the investigator's eyes, not surprise exactly, but acknowledgement, the look of people confronting information they had suspected but hoped was not true. The turning point came when Leora played the audio recording, a conversation she had secretly captured between her commanding officer and an unnamed official, discussing the need to neutralize her unit's investigation before their findings reached congressional oversight committees. The voices were clear, unmistakable, discussing the frame and Mason's unwitting role in it, with the casual efficiency of people executing a plan they had rehearsed, and the weight of that evidence seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room, transforming the interrogation from adversarial confrontation to something more complex, investigators recognizing they were part of a system that had been corrupted, that their role in this case made them instruments of the very conspiracy they were supposed to be preventing. The lead investigator, the woman, asked for a recess, and the 3 officials withdrew to confer privately, leaving Mason and Leora alone in the conference room with their fates suspended in bureaucratic deliberation. They waited in silence that felt like drowning in slow motion, minutes stretching into an hour and then longer, and Mason thought about Piper at Emma's house, probably playing in the backyard or watching cartoons, blissfully unaware that her father's freedom hung by threads being examined by strangers in a room he could not see. He thought about the choices that had brought him here, stopping for a stranded woman, agreeing to help her, pursuing truth instead of accepting convenient lies, and wondered if he had been foolish or brave or simply incapable of any other response. A man so shaped by his past that he could not help but walk into situations that required exactly the skills and damage he carried. Leora reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over his, a gesture of solidarity or gratitude or shared fear, and Mason nodded acknowledgement because words felt inadequate to the moment, to the weight of what they had risked and what still hung in balance. When the investigators returned, their faces betrayed nothing, but the lead investigator's first words carried weight that shifted the ground beneath Mason's feet. They were suspending the material witness warrant, opening a formal investigation into the surveillance evidence fabrication, and referring the audio recording to Military Criminal Investigation Command for prosecution of the officials involved in the arms transfer cover-up. It was not exoneration, not yet. But it was reprieve, a recognition that Mason and Leora were victims rather than perpetrators, and that the frame built in silence around them had been exposed to light that made its construction visible and therefore vulnerable. Mason felt something unclench in his chest, a tension he had been carrying so long it had become part of his baseline experience, and for a moment he could not speak, could only breathe and feel the simple relief of doors opening instead of closing, of futures extending rather than contracting. The aftermath stretched across weeks of depositions and testimony, of formal statements and media attention that Mason tried to shield Piper from with limited success, of watching from the sidelines as the investigation expanded to encompass officers and officials whose names he recognized from news coverage and political debates. Leora's unit was vindicated. Their evidence about arms transfers, triggering congressional hearings and military reforms. And through it all, Mason maintained his quiet life, returning to rideshare driving and school pickups and the ordinary rhythms that had been disrupted but not destroyed. He saw Leora occasionally, at follow-up meetings, or by chance at the courthouse where trials were beginning. And they shared the particular bond of people who had survived something together, who carried matching scars even as they rebuilt separate lives. The nightmares persisted, but changed character, losing some of their vicious intensity, and Mason learned to wake from them without the paralyzing fear that had accompanied their return, learned to recognize them as echoes rather than present threats, memories given form but lacking power to determine his present. He took Piper to therapy, recognizing that she had been affected by the upheaval even if she could not articulate how, and sat in waiting rooms reading magazines while she talked to someone trained to help children process trauma and uncertainty. They rebuilt trust slowly, through consistency and presence, through his willingness to answer her questions as honestly as age-appropriate language allowed, through the accumulation of ordinary days that proved the crisis had passed and their small life together could continue. On a night 6 months after Marines had surrounded his house, Mason stood on his porch under a moon that reminded him of the night he had stopped for Leora, and felt the weight of his choices settling into something approaching acceptance, if not quite peace. He had paid a cost for choosing truth, in fear and disruption, in trauma reawakened, and innocence complicated. But he had also proven to himself and his daughter that some things were worth the cost. That character was tested not in easy moments, but in the spaces where silence would have been safer, and speaking required courage that felt indistinguishable from foolishness. Piper called him from inside, asking him to come read her a story before bed, and Mason turned away from the moon and the empty street and went to his daughter, closing the door behind him on the night and its memories. choosing instead the warm light of home and the voice of his child asking him to tell her about heroes who made hard choices and lived to tell about them. And he smiled because he finally had a story worth telling, a truth earned through fire and fear, and the stubborn refusal to look away when looking away would have been so much easier.